Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Mount Apo Lactic Honey Processed Philippines from Wide Awake Specialty Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Wide Awake, based out of Manila, Philippines. And this is their first ever appearance on this channel. As they're a coffee roaster I had zero familiarity with going into this review. We picked this coffee up from Airworks as part of their January coffee drop, as it felt like a great opportunity to review our first ever Filipino-based coffee roaster, and in addition to that, our first ever Filipino coffee. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 57. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe and a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, it is interesting. This one did turn out a fair bit lighter than I was expecting going into it, as I had no idea what to expect from a coffee roaster like this. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say that it was on the same level as some of the lightest Asian-based coffee roasters we've had in the past, something like Mood Trap, but to my surprise, it was a fair bit lighter than a lot of the recent experiences we've had from a coffee roaster like Wesson Gopi, and even then, it's a fair bit lighter than a lot of American-based coffee roasters that we review as well. So once again, I would say maybe on the slightly more moderately light side of things, even with the unusual varietal composition and the processing of this coffee. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 28, first impression through the V60, and the first takeaway I had from this coffee was that it was surprisingly clean for what it was. A lactic honey processed Filipino coffee that's part Catamore. Yes, going into it, I certainly did not expect it to turn out very clean, but in addition to that, it had a higher than expected level of sweetness with an almost pudding-like feel to it, and a sweetness that was reminiscent of vanilla custard. So I was saying plenty of texture and plenty of sweetness, so I have something to at least work off of with this coffee. Additionally, a fair bit of an apple-like brightness leading to a very interesting start. And right before this review, I went to take a look at their website because I wanted to find out where this coffee roaster was based out of. And I saw that they were really accentuating the brightness of their coffees. That's what they're going for, is that they really want their coffees to be bright, which kind of explains why I got a little bit more brightness from that first impression and why I found the profile to be maybe a little bit on the lighter side of things. Day 31 through the Chemex, and it wasn't quite as impressive as the previous experience, as it did feel a little bit more traditional this time around with a slight honey and nutty feel, as well as some dried fig attributes to it as well. Some darker fruit aspects with a bit more of a prominent brightness coming through at the end. So this time around, I couldn't necessarily tell what had happened, and I did have some suspicions, but we will see how that plays out. As on day 34, we opted for the April Brewer, and relative to the first impression, I would say that the coffee has been a fair bit less impressive the next couple of times around, as this time around it's been a lot more in line with the expectations we had for a Catamore-like coffee. As I've said in the past, I feel like I can tell when there's Catamore in a coffee because it does have this just very specific feel to it that oftentimes is nuttied and spice and a little bit woody as well. And I also achieved some slight red berry attributes to it as well, as there is that brightness that's still present within it, but I can't shake that slight Catamore-like feeling that I get from coffees like this. So very mixed impressions this time around, but we move on to day 37 as we opted for the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments, lower temperatures, higher concentration. And the coffee was a little bit better this time around, as it felt a little bit more balanced. And what I noticed was right at the forefront, I was getting plenty of that sweetness once again, just very vanilla custard-like sweetness right at the onset with some subtle fruit qualities to it, but it does settle once again into that more spiced, woody Catamore-like experience. So it's twofold. You get some very enjoyable experiences right at the start, but I didn't necessarily enjoy the way that this coffee did finish on the back end. Day 40 through the Chemex, and I decided we might stick with the V60 going forward, as the biggest differentiating quality between these two brew methods is that the V60 did seem to accentuate a lot more of those vanilla custard-like qualities, while the Chemex did seem to accentuate a lot more of those Catamore spice-like tones to it, as it did seem to strip away maybe a little bit of the sweetness. So that was my big takeaway on this day. But we move on to day 43 as we opted for the V60 with our standard recipe once again. And it's a bit better today, and that's where I noticed some consistency, is that I was experiencing the best of this coffee when we were opting for the V60 with our standard recipe. So in theory, I probably could have pushed this coffee a little bit more, but given that I was already experiencing enough of those Catamore characteristics, I really did not want to experience more of those. Best of it does come right off brew, as it continues to offer that custard-like sweetness, a slight peachiness for the first time, and I was very happy to achieve that quality from this coffee, as I think it's one of the notes they have listed on here. But once again, it did seem to nosedive when it did cool down, and it did finish as it was offering much more of those Catamore-like characteristics. Day 46 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and it did continue to be night and day with the brew methods, and I really shouldn't have tried one more time with this one. If anything, I should have tried the opposite and pushed this coffee with the V60 to see how it might have turned out, just to experiment with it. But this did seem to strip away the cleaner vanilla characteristics in place of that strong Catamore-like experience once again, so somewhat of a throwaway day. But we move on to day 49 as we opted for the V60 with our standard recipe, and the coffee was very consistent with this brew method, with this adjustment in general, as it did have plenty of that sweetness at the forefront once again, followed once again by these spiced Catamore woody qualities, some dark berries, and some apple-like brightness and peach to go with it. So I would say these characteristics are pretty well defined, they're pretty pronounced, but at the same time, that's also something that can be said for the Catamore-like qualities of it. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s and level 3s, a lot of level 3s in fact, but let's go through it. We'll start with the cleanliness level 4. You know, that's a win in itself. You can just back up this review and say this is a victory that you were able to get a Lactic honey processed Filipino coffee to score a level 4 in terms of cleanliness. Now that I'm discussing this review, it does remind me of the fact that there really isn't anything in terms of the cleanliness that can be knocked down on this coffee. It doesn't have any funkiness, doesn't have any fermentiness, and yeah, while it does taste like Catamore, I mean, that's to be expected. It's not like it's presenting itself in a heavier or funky sense. So level 4 is honestly ideal for this coffee. It's just pretty much right there at that true level 4 mark. Finish level 4. I've mentioned that I don't particularly like the way that this coffee does finish. It has plenty of those spiced, woody qualities to it, which if I could maybe mitigate some of that, then this would be a much more enjoyable experience, given that there were some really nice qualities to it, most specifically the sweetness, which we'll go ahead and discuss right now. A lot of that vanilla custard-like sweetness to it. I don't think it's technically a note that they have listed on here. I think they say it's much more of the mouthfeel of this coffee, and I can see that. It does have a little bit of texture. You can see the body there at the level 3. But for me, I couldn't help but shake the feeling that it does have that slightly more vanilla-like sweetness to it, which was, for me, the most enjoyable part of this coffee, especially given that it was extremely consistent throughout. Could be the priming effect, or it could be that that's just the way that this coffee felt for me. We move on to the florality level 4, and I can't quite remember whether or not they had any sort of floral note listed on here. Not really, but for me, I said, okay, it still has a little bit more of a generic floral quality to it, and it could be because there was such a strong vanilla to it, and it was reminiscent of a vanilla-like florality for me, but that's where we opted to put the floral aspect to it, even though it's not something that they have listed on this one. Let's go ahead and move on to the level 3s. We'll start with the acidity level 3. And while I mentioned that this coffee did turn out a little bit brighter than I was expecting going into it, I wouldn't necessarily say that it was always the most consistent and abundant quality of this coffee, especially relative to the sweetness, which did seem to score just a little bit higher. So on the day that I was making this tasting, well, I said, relatively speaking, perhaps a little bit lower, but given what I was expecting for this coffee, it's definitely a little bit brighter than I thought going into it. And then we have a lot of level 3s. Spice level 3, we'll kind of run through these real quick. So yes, there is that Catamore-like spiced quality to it, and I was experiencing plenty of that. Same thing with the saltiness. There's a little bit of a nutty quality to this coffee as well. Could be an abundance of things. I think it's a bit more attributed to the Catamore in this coffee. Berry fruit level 3, getting a little bit of a darker berry tone to it. Not surprising within this coffee. Citrus fruit, pretty generic citric quality to it. Stone fruit level 3, a fair bit of that peach quality, a little bit more towards the end of this coffee, as it was the third to last day. That was the first time I'd experienced it in this coffee, and it was something that continued to be present. Citrus fruit, going back to it, it was that apple-like quality that was also a bit pronounced within this coffee. Savoriness level 3, that's going to be that slightly more woody quality that was present within this coffee. Body level 3, that's actually the last thing worth discussing on this tasting wheel, as it definitely had a little bit more texture to it, and that was fully expected for a coffee like this going into it. So we did kind of speed run through this tasting wheel, but there were a lot of things to touch on real briefly. So as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what we were getting from this coffee. It's also a very interesting looking tasting wheel, as we don't have a lot of them that look this way. All right, so my raw thoughts and impressions of this coffee, I could take it in one of two directions. I could either say that this coffee had some characteristics that I didn't necessarily like, or I could say that this coffee did turn out a little bit better than I was expecting. I think in theory, on paper, this is a coffee that has no business being something that I would enjoy. It's a much more processed coffee than I usually like. It's an origin that is maybe a little bit underrepresented because there aren't a lot of Filipino coffees that I would say that have a lot of success in general. And in addition to that, it's a Catamor, which is a varietal that I've never liked and have never had any success with. So all of these combinations of factors in theory should be something that I don't like whatsoever, but I found a lot of positives from this coffee. There was some really enjoyable sweetness to it. Even if at the end it was marred by some additional qualities to it, there was some interesting brightness, there was some interesting fruit qualities. So there's a lot of positives within this coffee. Yeah, it's not something that I would go back and purchase a lot, or it's not something that I would want to try very regularly. But I want to give credits to everyone involved in this coffee, the producers as well as the roaster, because I think it performed way above my expectations going into it, even if at the end of the day, it's still not something that I necessarily enjoyed that much. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, I feel like if you don't mind those spiced, woody characteristics of a Catamor coffee, then this one will have plenty of contrasting characteristics that made it very enjoyable. A well above average level of sweetness, some really enjoyable clarity. I didn't even mention the clarity when I was discussing my own opinions on this coffee. That's probably the biggest highlight and most impressive part of this coffee, is that this coffee turned out as clean as it did. So those are two things I would point out if you don't mind that characteristic, that Catamor-like characteristic. But that's honestly the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Mount Apo Lactic Honey Processed Philippines from Wide Awake Specialty Coffee. Thank you for watching.